All right, well, welcome to another segment of the Wild Wisconsin Off the Record podcast. For everyone listening, as a reminder, what we did this year, we tried something new. We started a web series called Wild Wisconsin, and we covered everything deer in that. Those videos are on YouTube. They're going to be very helpful for anywhere from a novice hunter to a diehard, so we hope you check those out. So what we do with these Off the Record podcasts is we use these as a tool for if something piqued your interest in those web series videos, which are a little shorter. We did one Off the Record podcast for every video segment as a way to kind of drill down further into a lot of those segments. And we brought a lot of folks along for these podcasts. Today we've got two great guys and some DNR guys as well. So today we're going to cover habitat management and its importance in not only deer hunting, but just overall quality of life out there, other wildlife. So we'll get into all that. So today we've got Eric Canania, the assistant big game ecologist at DNR, Eric Barber, who is the social media coordinator at DNR. We've got Curt Jacob and Kim Zuhlke, who are DMAP cooperators. They've been extremely active in the program. And we've got Bob Nack, our big game ecologist. So before we get started, I guess the primer of this is it all starts with good habitat. I think everyone would agree that that's just about square one in deer hunting. So we're going to talk about the DMAP program. We're going to talk about what Curt and Kim have maybe seen on their properties, what they've liked about the program, working with folks like Bob and Eric. So why don't we get started? We'll start with kind of a high-level question. I figured this one could be kind of a roundtable type question where everyone gets a crack at it, and then we'll get into some of the DMAP stuff and some of that. So, Eric, why don't we start with you? Why is habitat important to deer hunting? Super easy question, huh?
Well, habitat is the house and home of deer. So without that, you essentially will not have deer or deer hunting, and habitat is variable. It changes over time. Nothing is static, and you need to be able to read your habitat and how that is affecting deer and deer hunting.
Eric, what are your thoughts?
I think one of the best things you touched on there is how it's always changing. I mean, habitat, especially in a diverse state like Wisconsin, where we have, big timber cuts up in the northern part of the state and just such diverse habitat all throughout the state. It's really important to be able to identify the areas that are, most conducive to deer and where they're going to want to spend the most of their time and other wildlife. And, if you're not developing that line of understanding, I think you're in for a rough season. So,
Curt?
I think not just habitat in general, but you start looking at it from an annual basis. The habitat that deer are going to be using different times of the year. Obviously, everybody's concentrating on the hunting season, but what do those deer need during the winter after the season's done? Do they need thermal cover? Do they need more food other than just what the food plots and that are going to provide? So you really almost have to look at it as a year-round habitat.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. I think that's something a lot of people might not think about. They want that concentration where they want deer for that maybe week or month out of the year, but they might not be thinking long-term for a whole year. So I think that's an excellent point. Bob?
Yeah, I just try to, I think about deer habitat, I try to oversimplify it, and it to me, it is a lot of common sense. I mean, deer and any other critter out there needs food, shelter, and water. And, if you can provide that on your property, that's going to be to your benefit. And especially if you're thinking about deer, if you're a deer hunter, unless you're relatively new, you probably know kind of habitat and things that attract deer. And so it's not simply enough just to have trees on your property. As I'm sure we'll get into, there's some more activities that you need to do to really make it beneficial.
Kim?
Well, we do a lot of sharing of ideas. We do walkarounds on my farm and other farms. We're trying to, get good ideas on how to improve the habitat. And we boil it down to really it's food, cover, and water. It's just that simple. And if you go out there this time of year, most likely all of that exists. And then we go out and hunt, and then some guys are there year round. Other guys just don't have the ability or don't think about being out there, and it's a year-round process, and you really need to, I want to emphasize the whole idea of looking at it at different seasons of the year. And if you want to keep deer on your property, those three things have to exist. It's just that simple.
And you'll hear a lot of people too talking about how they can't wait for the next deer season. What you guys mentioned is the perfect way to keep deer season kind of going all year round, and I think people might not think about that too. That's a good way to kind of stay engaged and stay excited about deer hunting the whole year. It doesn't just boil down to when you're hunting. It's putting in that prep time too. So as I mentioned, Kim and Curt are both DMAP cooperators. So before we get into and that's the Deer Management Assistance Program. So before we get into more on that, Bob, can you just give kind of a high-level overview of what the DMAP program is?
Sure. So the DMAP program here in Wisconsin was rolled out in 2014, and it's really a program that, again, trying to keep it simple, is really focused on providing support to landowners that want to do good things for wildlife on their property. We can certainly focus on deer, but recognize that a lot of the work that you're doing for deer is going to benefit a whole suite of other wildlife species. And so landowners can sign up online, go to the DNR webpage and type in DMAP, and you create your own account when you sign up. There's 3 levels to the program. The first level, there's no cost to be enrolled, and there's no minimum acreage requirement. So really anybody that's interested in deer in general, and you might have a small acreage, certainly encourage you to sign up. The second level, and with all these levels, you get to know your local biologist. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the workshops that we do. You get a regular publications and information exchange from me. At that level 2, there is a minimum acreage requirement of 160 acres to enroll. There's an enrollment fee for a 3-year agreement that's $75. And with that, you get a couple additional benefits, including a site visit from a biologist and a forester, which is pretty unique, I think, to this program, in that you'll have two professionals show up at your property and do a site visit with you. And part of that too is a requirement for the landowner to be there, and so it's a real learning opportunity. And we've heard through our feedback we've gotten from cooperators that's the thing they really enjoy the most, is that walkthrough with a forester and a biologist. From that site visit, then the landowner will receive a management plan, a property-specific management plan based on the feedback they collect on the site visit, with goals for the property and some of the habitat improvement opportunities that are there. Along with another benefit, I guess, of the program too, if your intent is to try to make your property more attractive to deer, at some point there's a balance between what the habitat there can support for deer. And so another benefit of the program is landowners are eligible for reduced price antlerless tags. And so if you're really good at attracting a bunch of deer to your property, it's your responsibility then as well to keep the herd in balance with what's out there. And so those tags help landowners do that.
I think that's a problem. A lot of deer hunters wouldn't mind getting too good at attracting deer.
Well, some of that gets into also knowing what your neighbors are doing. We've got neighbors to the south of us that they'll tell you they just don't shoot any does. I've got there's 140 that borders me to the north. If it's brown, it's down. But everybody else kind of practices a little bit of quality deer management as far as letting the younger bucks pass. How young is too young? It's up to that personal, up to that private owner.
And speaking of neighbors, Bob, isn't there an option to work with your neighbors to do a co-op type of thing?
Yeah, there is. If as I mentioned, the acreage requirements and to enroll for a site visit and a plan and those benefits, 160 acres. Yeah, if you don't own 160 acres, we encourage people to sign or join cooperatives or form cooperatives, essentially working with your neighbors. And if your neighbors within a half mile of your property, you can combine your acreage. essentially managing the properties together. And as Curt mentioned, there's a lot of benefits to that, not only from a habitat standpoint, but also deer management goals. You're talking to your neighbor, and kind of getting on the same page. All too often, we hear from landowners, well, we don't want to shoot does because we know the guy, the neighbor across the fence is. But I have a feeling that they don't know that for sure because they're not talking to them. And so, this is trying to get everybody on the same page. And we've had some good success with the cooperatives so far.
I think that's so important right there in itself, is just getting neighbors to talk with one another. I mean, deer hunting is one of those sports where it's so, me, myself in a tree stand all alone, and people get protective over one deer or another. That's an awesome way to start bridging that gap and start building those relationships. So.
Right.
And another benefit to interacting with your neighbors is that they might have pieces of equipment or knowledge that you might otherwise not have, and being able to share a tractor, a four-wheeler, a disc, or a planter is going to save you time and money. And you're building that gap. So I think too often people focus just on what's happening and what's in their property, but don't really realize that deer are not just using most people's properties exclusively. They're going on their neighbors. So habitat projects on your neighbors, development on your neighbors, or hunting tactics from your neighbors is going to affect your property as well. So better communication with neighbors is definitely a key to better deer hunting.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So Bob, you had mentioned management plans. For people listening, can you maybe just give an overview of what may be in one of those, some of the recommendations that people may get?
Yeah, so the DMAP management plans, we try to find a balance between making it useful, obviously, for the landowner. We want it to be clear and legible and understandable to them. And so we do cover a little bit of the history of the property, a general description of the property. But the meat of the plan is providing recommendations to improve the habitat. And then we provide a map of where to do it. So what you should do, where to do it, timelines and the seasonality of habitat work is in there as well. In some of the recommendations, it depends on where you are in the state. Of course, northern Wisconsin, we talk a lot about timber management and early successional stage forests, especially as it relates to deer or grouse or woodcock.
So young forest, essentially.
Young forest is a primary recommendation if you can do it. Certainly in northern Wisconsin. In the south, we talk more about invasive species and invasive species management, which I'm sure these guys can relate to. And we'll talk about food plots and things like that if landowners are interested in that type of thing. Certainly talk about those opportunities, but also talk about the pros and cons of food plots, but any habitat work. So.
One of the topics we've talked a lot about with the biologists and as we've done the walk on my farm is the regeneration of oaks. And we've got an overpopulation of deer, and the whole ecology's changed from a dairy sort of industry to a little different sort of industry in which we don't pasture in the woods, and we've got old growth oaks that aren't regenerating, and we want to refresh that woods. But how do you do that? And how do you nurture oaks? Because if there's anything you can do for your deer, I like to have guys start with what their natural resources are there already. And if you've got oaks on your property, how do you get them to produce or recognize which trees are producing, and then maybe see if you can start adding some additional oaks into your stand? And we have had hours of discussion on it and thinking about best practices for that.
So, Curt and Kim, as you mentioned, both DMAP cooperators. So I figured we'd ask both of you, and we can start with Curt. So I guess what piqued your interest with DMAP? Why are you a cooperator?
I'm a cooperator because it enhances everything that I've already been doing. I've always had an interest. We bought our property 10 years ago. It was a fresh slate, and we've recorded every hunt, what we've seen, how many deer, bucks, does, how many hours you sat on stand. we've even gone as far as having the property gridded out. Which part of the grid did you sit in, and things like that. And you see trends over time. Some of them get into if you hunt in the stand too much, so things may drop off. But then over the course of time, you also start putting a history together of what you're seeing, where you're seeing amount of sightings per deer out per hunter hour. The other thing is I've always had an interest in what deer eat, and really the one way to really assess that is knowing what you have as far as plant species. It can get overwhelming as far as knowing all the plants, but maybe just learn the top 10 and figure out, then know those and then find them on your property. See how you can help manipulate them, whether it's clear cuts or whatever they need. All plants need sunlight to a certain point, so open some things up. But it's the reason I've joined and cooperated is because it's just a natural progression of what I've always done.
That's great. So Kim, why DMAP for you?
Well, it may be similar to Curt in that we've been doing a lot over the years. I can't say there's a week that goes by that we don't think about something about managing the land. And we've always have active projects, but it's not a job for us. We like it. I mean, we enjoy doing it. It gets you in the woods year round, and
it can get overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the reasons I was maybe hesitant to join DMAP is my list of things to do is very long, and I don't need more. It's sort of like, who's going to implement this? My 3 children are always wondering what the next project is because we're never done. But I think the fun part was walking the land with the biologist and thinking about what deer eat and where they're going to be. And I don't know all the species, and I was amazed at how many species that deer do eat. And they are they have big appetites, and they'll eat a lot of different things. And we've learned. We're always trying to look for the next idea. A good example for me was on the farm. We've got these coulees with staghorn sumac, and I just never. I mean, the sumac is pretty in the fall, but I just never really thought of it as much of other than just maybe some cover. And one of the biologists said, "Well, yes, deer love staghorn sumac." And I said, "You're kidding." I said, I took one of my hunting buddies, I said, "Have you ever seen staghorn browse?" And he says, "No, I never have." So that fall we went out, and the mature stuff was not browsed, but anything that was little, 2-3 feet tall, sure enough, in the spring we had all this browse. And I'm going, I'd sure like to have them browse on my sumac rather than my oaks. So, one practice that I'm now doing is that anytime I've got staghorn sumac that I'm okay with it being there, I mow it. And I'm keeping that stand fresh. So what you end up with is cover and food in a coulee that wouldn't be producing any ag crops or anything else.
Box elder's another one you can do the same thing with. It's in the maple family, and deer will browse box elder. You don't necessarily want it in there for a timber species, but if you cut that, forester says make sure you treat that when you cut it. Well, there's a lot of nice green shoots coming up off there that are feeding deer in a high stress time over the winter. So I usually don't treat it. I just cut it, and if something gets above the deer's level, I cut it, let it stump sprout again.
So, I think everybody's in a little different place with their property and what their knowledge is and what their goals are. And so from the standpoint of, you take guys like Curt and I who've been doing this for a long time, and we're still learning. I mean, it's kind of a journey. It's not like you arrive, my habitat's perfect. It's just kind of, every year you see something that you want to do, and it becomes really a passion. It's really fun.
Well, I think one of the things that's really cool, just listening to you guys talk about this, we've been discussing this for probably about 10 minutes, and we've mentioned food plots once. So that's one thing that the hunting media, is created such an interest in food plots. And when guys buy land, when they lease land, whatever the case may be, one of the first things they want to do is throw a food plot in the mix. Obviously, that's part of the process, but there's so much other stuff, you know, by getting involved with the DMAP program that you're probably going to open your eyes to. And it's, I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Well, deer are browsers. I mean, it's nuts, sticks, and berries. Maybe some leafy plants. Get more of that down to their level, and they'll be happy.
You know, I hunt both in northern Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin, and they're two very different ecosystems. And I talk with, and I've done land walks with, you know, buddies on their land, and what we've learned, you're right, the food plot is like, oh, what seed should I get, and all that stuff, and that's kind of like the second question. But really, where we start is, what do you have on your land now? What resource do you have? And in the southern part of the state, you know, oaks is one, and it's amazing how many wild apple trees that are out there. And you can trim them up, fertilize them, whatever. Think about, you know, those as a resource. If you've got some land that you can put a little pond in, a little water resource, it really helps when those deer when the bucks are chasing in the fall and they need a drink in the afternoon. It can really help, you know, bring in deer. And so that's the stuff that I think can really make a difference.
And I'm glad you brought up food plots, because, like you said, too often people buy a piece of land and the first thing they want to do is put a food plot on there. Well, deer biologically are browsers, and what they should be doing is focusing on their timber, the other types of habitat, food that equals, or structure that equals food and cover. Those two concepts are key. A food plot only provides one of them, and your long-term effects are going to be benefited more from timber production or high timber value for wildlife, whereas that should be started first, unlike food plots. And one of the things that the DMAP site visit outlines, and a lot of people don't realize, is what is actual deer browse, what does it actually look like, what isn't deer browse, and you know, what are deer feeding on at different types of the year. And you know, a deer might be feeding on a certain plant or a bush in the winter, and you think, oh, that's got to be good deer food, but oftentimes that's a low-level browse species that the indication with that is your habitat isn't supporting the deer that are there, and they're resorting
It's the best of what's
to
left.
exactly. So
Yep.
that's a really good benefit of the site
Well,
visit.
one thing I went through, you know, I mentioned is purchased my property about 10 years ago, is after the purchase, I sat down with a questionnaire. I think it was University of Oklahoma or Oklahoma State or something puts it out. This particular one it's a habitat questionnaire. You go through to evaluate your property, and it goes through water, thickness of your brush, things like that, but you end up finding out what the weaknesses of your property are. And for my particular property, it's thermal cover in the winter and winter food. You know, having green food plots, they're not going to get you through December, January, February in this part of the woods. They're going to be eating your browse, and to get that, you need things down where they can reach them. That's why I talked about cutting box elder and things like that. Get those tops down there. That helps for that year. If the green shoots come up the next year from the stump sprouts, you've got a couple of years there. But again, it's only 2 or 3 years. You always have to keep manipulating some way, or maybe have a timber harvest in some part of the property.
And in talking with you guys, we've mentioned year-round a few times now, and it's just one of those things where the carrot's always going to be out in front of you. Like you mentioned, you're never gonna learn everything.
Right.
But I think, for me personally, that's kind of the fun part, because it'd get kind of boring if you knew everything. Like, you're never going to get to that perfect 80-acre parcel. There's always going to be something you can do next year. So I think that's refreshing for a lot of people. So the flip side of getting the site visits, you guys mentioned before we started filming this, we were talking about the workshops. So what have you got? So for DMAP, you get workshops with other cooperators. So what have you guys gotten out of those?
You know, we kind of talked about earlier, the I'll show you mine, I'll show you, you show me yours type thing. And You did get to see different things that people are trying on their property and what works. Maybe because of your terrain and the type of woods you have, they're completely different, and maybe it won't work. But maybe it's something you want to try. Maybe you've got something to offer somebody else who stops by or that you can talk to. But there's always something that you can learn somewhere. So
One of the things with the DMAP program, you know, the workshops and the way we structure them, we have it's a one-day workshop, an indoor session, and then we do a tour of somebody's property. And you know, Curt, in the early, maybe the first year, gave a tour of your property, and you know, one of the things we're learning with people that sign up for the program, they're very open and willing to share what their, I mean, you just heard it here today, share their experience, what they've tried, what's worked, what doesn't work, and you know, even the deer they harvest, the number of deer, the size of the bucks, whatever. It's been a great kind of open discussion, and I know a lot of people, at least from the response we've gotten from those workshops, they've been very popular.
And you guys have mentioned a few times too that you've been involved with this type of thing for a long time. It's kind of what makes your clock tick. But from your perspective, and maybe Bob and Eric, you guys can speak to this too. But one thing I've noticed, just from my own personal experiences, kind of the active habitat management, the culture is kind of changing on people taking a more active role specifically for deer hunting. It seems like, I don't know what you guys have noticed, but at least down by me where I hunt, it's gotten a lot bigger, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll let these guys comment to it, but my perspective on that is, you know, with technology and, you know, largely technology, I think as a hunting culture, we're getting to be a lot smarter. And I think most people understand that, and as I let off, that just because you have trees doesn't mean you're going to have deer.
Right.
And people are understanding that, and then there's organizations and programs out there that are promoting, you know, a lot of habitat work, and so it's almost becoming the culture, you know. And it's a good, I mean, if you're a landowner here in Wisconsin, for wildlife, that's a good culture to have.
Yeah. And we're trying a lot of new things, a lot of different things that we didn't think about doing before. You know, on my farm, you know, the farm has to be economically viable. So I'm doing the prairies and the food plots, but I rent out the farmland, and I've converted all of the farmland to organic. And the reason is because if you think about the highest and greatest use for my land would be continuous corn. And continuous corn, today's corn is not very good habitat. It's great cover in the summer, but if you're a really good farmer, you don't have many weeds. And today's combines don't leave much behind. And so it looks really nice in the summer and the fall, and then after November you've got kind of this barren field. And so from the standpoint of from the organic production, I get a better rotation. We don't do continuous corn, and then I get more insects and more weed seeds for my birds and for those things. So for me, it was an economic wash. It wasn't because it was more or less financially advantageous, but you just have that sort of rotation and cultivation was a great advantage to me.
Well, and I think, Bob, you hit the nail on the head with like the technological advancements that we've had as deer hunters. You know, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you know, deer hunters, they maybe read a magazine or something in the newspaper, went to, you know, maybe a seminar with a group of different hunters every year. Now we have so many different websites. There's apps for your phone. There's organizations dedicated to deer management. So we just have so many resources available at our fingertips that I think that's why we're seeing this increase in interest, I guess, when it comes to deer management, property management, you know, for wildlife specifically. So I think we're entering a really good time because we just do have so much available, but it definitely is a change, I think.
I still have the little box with a little tripwire that you put on the tree, and it recorded the time that something tripped the wire.
That's awesome.
I think, you know, as a hunting culture, we've changed from just going out during the 9-day and harvesting a deer and having that be it, but to be more stewards of the land in most cases, where you get pride out of managing your property, and maybe you don't go out and harvest a a mature deer this year, but you're able to see deer feeding and utilizing, or just other animals, other wildlife using your property in some way that you've helped manage it. So that in itself gives individuals pride, landowners pride in that, versus just harvesting deer. You know, that's a shift, and I think that's a good shift. It's going to be, as you know, land changes, habitat changes, more fragmentation occurs, that having that valued as a society is going to be key in the future.
I think that's an excellent point. So we kicked this whole thing off with why is habitat important for deer hunting, but I think another good question, and this is going to be kind of anecdotal for you guys, but so how can active management, you being on the land, boots on the ground, how can that improve your hunting experience? I mean, I guess in your own eyes, everyone's probably going to be a little different, whether it's seeing more deer, seeing bigger deer, seeing other wildlife, but I guess maybe we'll go around the table again and maybe touch on that.
So I kind of feel, you know, active management to improve your hunting experience. First off, you're learning your land. The more active management you're doing, I mean, more out there, the more you're learning not only what comprises your property, but the deer that are utilizing that as well. So that's going to carry over directly to your hunting experience. You're going to know how deer are using the lay of your land and in what times of year, because it's not how do I explain it? It's not the same throughout the year. They're going to be doing different things, using different parts of your property in the spring, summer, fall, and late winter. So knowing how your land plays into that is going to be important, and active management's going to be beneficial for you.
I think, you know, as far as active management is concerned, I obviously don't own any land myself, but I was really fortunate to grow up, you know, right down the street from 40 acres that I had sole permission to hunt. And I hunted that from about the time I was 12 until I was, you know, just a few years ago. And as I, you know, continued to learn more about habitat and, you know, management and whatnot, I started to kind of, you know, dissect the property, I guess, with some of the things that I was learning. And I've added a water hole just 1 year. And added this little, you know, tiny water hole. And in 1 year I went from, you know, having very poor sits, you know, not seeing a whole lot of deer, to my wife and I both shot, you know, our biggest bucks ever that year over that little water hole. So that's just one example on a very small property, very small, you know, financial investment into that. You know, as far as creating the water hole, it was literally a $12 plastic kiddie pool. So I use the term water hole very lightly, but that's just an example of some of the things that you can do if you're actively managing your property, that I think you're going to see return on that in the long run.
Yeah, a lot of it is just you become more vested in your property, generally more interested in everything that's going on with it. You just feel a little bit more vested, and you take a lot more pride in that. That's probably the biggest reason for me. So.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking along the lines of Eric Barber's comments with doing something. You know, time. We know that time is limited and funds are limited for many landowners, but I think just doing something. If you're not satisfied with your deer hunting, you know, it doesn't take much with deer. Especially you cut something and they'll show up. And so really, you don't have to think about it on a very large scale. The spot that I deer hunt up in Price County, the landowner, it was 70 acres and the aspen, it was mostly aspen and some tag alders, and it was 35, 40 years old. And we just, you know, it's pretty standard grouse management techniques, small clearings. And, you know, over the course of a winter, he got enrolled in the MFL program and did that, and has been very happy with the results. He's seeing more deer. And so it you know, again, those are a couple easy steps that you can take.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's impacted me in looking at the habitat is it's actually driven me to look big picture, relative. I don't care if you got 40 acres or 120 or whatever it is. Take a look, go look at Google Earth and start looking at your surrounding territory and see where do you think deer are eating, where do you think they're bedding, where do you think their sanctuaries are, and all of a sudden you'll start asking your neighbor, are you going to put beans on that field this spring, you know, or what's your plans for this? And what if you and I just left this 20 acres as a sanctuary and neither one of us would go into this area, and the line fence goes down through the middle of it. Well, both of us, you start thinking, okay, about the habitat in a larger scope. I think there's some really cool things you can end up doing.
Absolutely. So this is as good a group to ask as any. Easy question. Knowledge of what good habitat looks like makes you a better deer hunter. That seems like a pretty agreed upon thing, and DMAP is an opportunity to, maybe you're not that far along in knowing some of that stuff, but kind of to learn as you go and kind of see yourself progress as a hunter and see your property get better. So we've talked a lot about deer. So with DMAP and that active management, Bob and Eric, maybe you want to talk to this first, but is there other things you're going to see other than hopefully more deer with the DMAP program? What are some of the other benefits?
Well, I know Curt had an interest in songbirds or forest birds at one time.
Yeah, I still do, and it's we did a clear cut in 2013, and it didn't take long. The next spring, through the migration, the warbler, sparrow, towhees. I mean, it's the whole hillside. You'd walk through there, and it was just like it was alive. I mean, everything moved, and it's even gotten to be more so over the sequential years. With one of the, we planted and put in some warm season CRP last year, and I took a walk through that on Sunday, and it's the same thing, just a different time of the year now. There was a sit that I had on Saturday night was above a thinning that was, it's all blackberry and raspberry brush now, and it was just alive. And
yeah, that's I think one of the neat things about the program is you get, landowners, and in Wisconsin, it's a big deer hunting state, right? And that's great. And so they buy recreational land because they're interested in deer hunting. And so they get in this program, and then they meet with a biologist, and you start talking about deer, but you start talking about grouse and woodcock and turkeys and songbirds, and they feed on that, and all of a sudden you can see their heads thinking, oh yeah, and they start, through the program, we encourage them to record your wildlife observations, and so all of a sudden they're thinking more about grouse. Well, I just heard a drumming grouse, and they start tracking that stuff, and it just builds inside, I think, which is great.
Curt and I were talking about milkweed on our respective farms and and this year I would have never guessed we would have done this, and 5 years ago we were recording how many monarch butterflies the family saw in a day, and we're just curious as to know what the habitat's doing and what the changes are, and with all the pollinator stuff going on, we were very, very curious, so we started recording it.
One of the things that we noticed when we had that timber harvest in 2013 is the turkey seasons before that, sometimes they would be there, sometimes they wouldn't. But since that first year of growth, the turkeys are always there, because now the nesting habitat's there, the hens are always there, and that brings the toms in. So if you can get early successional habitat in, it's going to attract so many more species than just deer. It's a good thing to cut some trees.
And that's a good example. I've done active timber management in the past, and we would be doing TSI, hinge cutting, on a piece of property to improve not only economics but deer habitat, and we would see indirect responses that were, you're creating a micro habitat, a microclimate when you're doing active management, and you'd see an insect response, and therefore the turkeys were in there. And then we would constantly be cutting and doing other management practices, and throughout the summer we just started seeing more and more turkeys, more and more dusting sites. We were making nesting sites, and the landowner next year said he's never seen so many turkeys, and that was an indirect response to what we were doing. And that kind of plays into part of this program's DMAP, or the Deer Management Assistance Program. And deer are an umbrella species. You actively manage for deer, and you benefit all the species underneath it. So they're generalist and edge specialist. And when you kind of make habitat favorable to that, you're going to benefit a lot of other species. And, I guess tying into that, when you have a site visit, a lot of times landowners don't know the values of certain timber species. And you might have a bunch of mature white oaks or black walnut that are, going to be shortly past their the prime of their lives, and you're going to lose economic potential. And you can go in, you can open up your property, activate new growth, get some money out of it, and then use that money to put into other active management. We're like, man, I don't have enough money to put in a food plot or put in trails, but little do people know, their timber is worth something, and that money can be put directly into the property, and that's a
good way to point that out, because my CRP payment that I get every year, that's my budget for what I'm doing the next year. And just kind of roll it. It's generated by the property. It stays with the property is how I look at it. So.
And generally property's rated at a base price based off of the area. So it could be worth $3,000 an acre, but you could have a veneer walnut tree on that property that's worth $10,000, and to the untrained eye, I guess, so to speak, you'd never know that. So.
And those are things you're going to learn as you kind of move through these programs. And Bob, you kind of mentioned too the wildlife observation, recording that. Can you talk a little bit about, for maybe the people who like to dig into the data metrics, can you talk about that side of DMAP?
Sure. So one of the things with DMAP that we provide the opportunity and encourage landowners to do is collect data, and not only I think of it in two areas. One is data on the deer they harvest, and so part of the reason for doing that is one, to if you have goals for your property, and in some cases it's more deer or less deer or more mature deer or whatever it might be. If you're not writing it down or recording what you've harvested, you're relying on your memory, and if anybody's like me, my memory is short. And so developing a long-term data set on the deer you harvest is a good thing, and we have it set up in the DMAP program for people to do that. The other aspect of data collection is the wildlife reaction to your habitat work, really. And so I kind of touched on it earlier. If you're in your tree stand or at the cabin or whatever, start recording the critters you're seeing out there. And again, over time, you can track that. And you may have done an aspen clear cut for grouse. Well, if you're doing drumming counts in the spring and tracking that over time, you're going to be able to see that response, which is pretty rewarding. If you're not writing it down, it just might not be as solid in your memory bank. So so those are things we certainly encourage. And each year for the level 2s and 3s that get site visits, we provide it's called an annual harvest report, and it summarizes the data on the deer that they've entered into the database. Now it's up to the cooperator to enter that data, and so the report's only going to be as good as the data you put into it. And so some of our cooperators are really, really into it, and they do that, and others choose not to, and that's fine. But yeah, it's a kind of a unique aspect of the program.
And correlation doesn't always equal causation, but one thing that would be interesting to me is to look at those independent factors and see kind of where there may be overlap, things you might not think about. So one year it was really good in this aspect, and we had a really good deer hunt, and you may not have think about those crossing over before. So that's something that's interesting to me. I think that's a cool part of it. But so it sounds like you guys, safe to say, you're both glad that you have enrolled in DMAP. So for people who are listening that might be on the fence, might not be sure, how easy is it to get into DMAP on the most basic scale? So what does someone need to do to get started?
Well, so for signing up, we try to make it as easy as possible. That you can go to the DNR webpage, type in keyword DMAP, and see more on the information on the program, and then hit a button, and you create your own account, so it is protected by a user ID and password. So there's a little bit of a couple steps there to do it, but we've found from feedback through cooperators that that's manageable. And once you get through that step, it's pretty straightforward. So, and people can sign up at level 1. I mean, we've had that. We've had landowners do that too. They're like, I'm not too sure about this program, and I don't know how much time I'm going to have to dedicate to it. You're going to tell me all this stuff to do to help my property. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. And our message is, hey, sign up at level 1. It's not going to cost you anything. Get your foot in the door. Get involved, as involved as you want to be. And then we've had cooperators do that, and then in the next year or maybe 2 years, they say, okay, I'm ready, for site visits and stuff like that.
And there's also an option to make your contact information available. So once you get in at level 1, and you make your information available, you're not going to get a ton of calls from other DMAP cooperators and that, but then you're also getting the contact information for other cooperators. And you can give them a call, ask them what their thoughts are, as long as they've done the product program and that. Another thing we haven't talked on at all is the county deer advisory committees for CDAC. You can look up your county representative for DMAP in each county, just and get some input from them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up too. So kind of moving forward here, I'm going to kind of combine 2 bullet points. So we've talked about kind of the nuts and bolts of how to sign up. So overall, what do you guys think for someone who wants to see more deer on their land? They weren't happy last season maybe with the amount of deer that they saw. What's one thing that every landowner can do to get started? Obviously other than enrolling in DMAP, but how do they get their foot in the door? Do they have to have kind of this deep ingrained interest in habitat, or?
I think it goes, back to kind of what we talked about earlier with active management. Just like you said, Bob, just do something. I read a lot of like deer hunting blogs, and the common root, especially during the off season, is just do something. Whether it's rake a path to your tree stand, make sure you got a nice, easy access into your favorite spot, or making a kiddie pool, or doing something as large scale as a timber harvest on your property. There's all different levels of things that you can check off your list during the off season, and that's really going to lead to, a more rewarding hunt, I think, in the fall. Whether you're seeing more deer or not, at least you know that, hey, I did that, and that's something that, is part of my plan moving forward into this year. So I think just doing something is the starting point.
And I think it's important to note that habitat management is not a sprint. It's something that you're going to work on. It's going to take years, and it's always going to be evolving. And the biggest thing I think I would recommend to landowners is getting to know your land. You need to have a baseline of what habitat you have, vegetative communities, your soil composition, tree health and age, where your access is, your neighbor information. But you got to have some type of a baseline data to know what management you're going to do in the future, and how that management is, how the wildlife is responding to that management. If you're doing something, you need to know if it's working, and you won't know if something's working without knowing how things responded before it started. So I think just taking a step back, knowing your land, and realizing, this isn't a sprint. You have time. Work within your means, your capabilities, and doing something is going to get you somewhere. So
If you go back to one thing that somebody can do to make their deer hunting better right now, grab a chainsaw and go out and cut something. I mean, it's quick.
Stress relief.
It's quick exercise.
Yeah, get the hockey mask on.
This is where it helps to know what you're cutting. I mean, you don't want to go out and cut a young tree that could be quality timber someday, but maples, they're usually a dime a dozen. Go out and cut a few of them. They're good browse species. Cut enough of them so it opens up a little spot in the canopy to get. You're going to get the growth or the browse from the tops right away. You get light hitting the floor. You're going to get the young growth coming in behind it then the next year. So fire it up.
My thought went a little bit different from habitat. I was thinking to get started, pick up the phone and contact your local
Talk to somebody.
biologist. We have one in every county or every 2 counties. and they'd be more than willing to help you out and have a conversation with you. And they have the experience of working with other landowners. So yeah, call your local DNR biologist. And then the other, kind of piggybacking on that, I'm looking at the shirts around me, the Culverts program and QDMA. There's tons of organizations and programs out there that, again, if you're not ready to jump into active management yourself, you can test the waters a little bit by participating in some of those programs.
I would just recommend prioritization. You're going to probably fall in one of two camps. One is, I've got a new lease or I got new land and I don't know what to do, or I've got a lease and land with a list of things I can do, and I don't have enough time to do them. And I think one of the more satisfying things you can do is pick one or two that you can implement and do and follow up with, and you'll see results, because you won't do it all. It's a journey. It's not a sprint. And pick the things that you think are going to get a biologist, get another hunter to walk the property with you, get some good ideas, prioritize, and then I think you'll be a lot happier if you take it off in bite-sized pieces.
And once you get a list and decide what you want to do, items on that list can seem daunting too, but the Natural Resource Conservation Service, Pheasants Forever, Wild Turkey Federation, QDMA, I mean, they can all give you ideas and where to turn to. And RCS could even have some programs that you could get into that maybe you get a little bit of financial benefit from too, besides to help you with future projects.
And like Eric had mentioned too, with technology, I think that's a great point, that managing your land shouldn't seem inaccessible. It shouldn't seem like this daunting top of the mountain thing, that whether on the internet or through partner groups or through DMAP cooperators, there are tons of resources out there to help. So it shouldn't feel like you're on your own, or you may feel like you're getting thrown into the deep end, just because there's so many resources available that can kind of help you get started and get to the level that these guys are at, where they're doing probably some of the more advanced stuff now.
Kimmel, I will be the first ones to tell you can bite off more than you can chew.
Clearly.
Well, you guys didn't have to admit that on camera. That was very noble of you right there.
It's like eating the elephant, bite at a time. You know what you can do what you can.
Yeah.
So we kind of touched on this, but one thing we like to close a lot of these podcasts with is kind of the one thing theme. So what's one thing, we'll go around again, maybe that you wish you knew earlier in managing your land, that someone that's maybe just getting into it would really help them right now?
I think the most important thing, and it's kind of what I touched on before, is just knowing what your property has to offer, being able to identify species and how the deer are using those species. So the better you know your land, the better you're going to be able to make future management decisions, and that's going to affect your deer hunting positively. So
I agree. I mean, going off of that, I think one thing too to recognize is if you line up, I don't care how many different deer hunters, 100 different deer hunters, and ask them what their favorite parts about deer hunting is, you're going to get 100 different answers. So DMAP is one of those programs that, whether you want to see more deer, you'd want to, whatever your experience is that you're going after, it'll help you get to that level. Same thing for non-hunters. People own properties for lots of different reasons. If people simply just want to see more wildlife, DMAP is probably a great avenue to use to pursue that.
One thing to go off of Eric's comment about knowing what you have as far as plants and that, again, knowing what the neighbors have as far as topography, plant species, things like that. The neighbors to my north, their vegetation and the shrub layers and down are completely different than mine. I can see why deer are coming to mine instead of staying on theirs all the time. I mean, it's just clear underneath. Maybe a patch of raspberry brush here and there, but it's completely different.
Hope they're not watching.
I hope they are.
Well, in my comments, maybe not what I wish I knew, but maybe just some closing thoughts, and Eric hit on one of them that we probably failed to mention with the DMAP program, is that it's the tagline is a partnership for healthy deer and healthy habitat. And so we have people enrolled in DMAP that are maybe not trying to attract more deer to their property, and oftentimes it's because they're logging and they're doing some active timber management.
Right.
They got too many deer, even in northern Wisconsin, and so they're interested in the program more from the antlerless tag aspect and trying to reduce deer numbers. And so, the program's great in that it works with people to balance those goals. And then, the other thought I had as far as active land management, and just getting involved with that is, that the healthy lifestyle aspect of it, getting out in your woods, walking and swinging a chainsaw or whatever you're doing. And then engaging your, I have a young family, so we enjoy taking our girls out there and they're picking up sticks and
Better known as the help.
the help. Well, I don't know how much help they are sometimes, but we get them out there and they're finding stuff, and so it's just a neat family thing to do too, and to spend time outdoors and they're learning and you're making some progress on your goals too. So
Yeah, I would say just think food, cover, and water, and think year round. I think thinking around the clock helps a lot in terms of having deer there. And then the last piece would be just enjoy it, have fun with it, have fun with it year round.
Does anyone have any closing thoughts? Words of wisdom? Something deep?
One thing maybe to touch on with Kim's comment about year round is if you're not managing year round and you don't know what your weaknesses are, the deer are eating your browse during those stress periods. And make sure you get out there and make sure your deer numbers are right for your situation. And this can help you do that.
just a closing thought on the DMAP program. One of the things when we kind of designed the program, we tried to make it as user friendly as possible, and honestly no strings attached. And the goal is to help landowners, and so I think we've successfully done that. The feedback that we get through surveys on people that are in the program is very high. And so I think people appreciate that they're not signing up and committing to something that they have to do. And so it's really designed to be kind of a mutual learning opportunity for everyone involved, including the DNR. I mean, you got guys here that have a lot more experience over the years of managing land, and so we learn from them too.
Yeah, I think the thing we've learned with DMAP and with QDMA is the landowner, give them the information and let them set their goals, because they're all in unique situations. They have unique resources, they got unique experiences that they want to have for their family or whatever. So give them the tools that they can enjoy their land or their lease in a much better way. And it's not like you're being told what to do.
No.
As much as you're being given tools to accomplish what you think will work for you and your family.
And technology's got a little something to do with that. Everybody's got their opinions and theories on how to hunt and what to hunt, and nobody's right. Or no, I should say nobody's wrong.
Right.
I like the first one.
Better way of saying it.
You can do it the way you want to, and as far as some of the other government programs, whether it be state or federal, DNR is the DMAP is strictly that. It's just a tool. Nobody's dictating to you what to do through this program. They're just giving you the tools to use as you will to make it a better hunting experience for you.
I think it's important to note that private landowners in the department, we're all on the same team. We're all working towards a common goal. We want to ensure that this tradition of deer hunting is just as deeply rooted now as it is in 50 years. So we can learn from each other, and we're all here to work together. So as soon as we can start doing that, we're all going to benefit. And the habitat, the resource, and the future of deer hunting is going to benefit.
That's the deep thought we were.
Well,
So we better close on that one. That's perfect. Before we say something stupid. But so thanks for joining us. and thanks for taking the time out of your guys' day to join us as DMAP cooperators. Hopefully someone who's listening to this, it piques your interest. You head out the back door and go walk your property and start thinking about this stuff. We're going to put links to DMAP and some managing your land links under this video. So it's never been easier to get involved in DMAP. The feedback we're getting is good. These guys touched on a lot of important topics about this. It's just a tool. These aren't mandates that you have to go out and do it. This is going to give you a toolbox to hopefully manage your land just how you want it. So again, I just want to thank our sponsors, Legendary Whitetails, Mayville Engineering Company, and Vortex Optics. Without them, none of this would have been possible. We're trying to kind of change the way we do things, and I think this is a step in the right direction. As a reminder, check out the web series segments if you haven't. They're at dnr.wi.gov, keywords Wild Wisconsin, on our YouTube page, WIDNR TV, Facebook and Twitter pages. We've got an Instagram now, WI_DNR, so check that out. I think that about wraps it up. So thanks for joining us for another Off the Record podcast. This one we talked about habitat. I think we had some great discussions. So get out on your land and start exploring.